Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson. Today is Saturday, November 18th, 2023. This is The Excerpt. Today, UN officials ring alarms about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Plus, Trump ramps up his rhetoric, and we look at the controversial project to reintroduce wolves in Colorado. Internet and phone communications were restored to parts of Gaza today. That ends a blackout that forced the UN to shut down humanitarian aid deliveries. UN agencies released statements this week saying the territory's 2.3 million people are at risk of starvation and face an increased threat of disease as water desalination plants and sewage facilities stop operations. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says around 70% of the population in Gaza is drinking salinized and contaminated water. And the World Health Program says only 10% of necessary food supplies have entered Gaza since the war began last month. Meanwhile, an Israeli airstrike hit a residential building in Khan Yunis, killing at least 26 Palestinians, according to a doctor at the hospital where bodies were taken. The town is located in Gaza's south. Israel's military has told civilians to flee northern Gaza while also continuing a bombardment of the territory's south. Israel continues to push for the release of hostages taken in a Hamas attack last month. Thousands of marchers, including families of some hostages, set off yesterday on the fourth leg of a 5-day walk from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, chanting, "Bring them home." Some have urged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet to consider a ceasefire or prisoner swap in return for the hostages. Hamas offered to exchange all of the approximately 240 hostages for some 6,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails, which the cabinet rejected. Former president and 2024 Republican frontrunner Donald Trump is on the campaign trail today with an event in Iowa as he increasingly ramps up his rhetoric. I spoke with USA Today national political correspondent David Jackson for more. David, thanks for making the time.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's just start here. Who did Donald Trump refer to as vermin? And why are some observers concerned, David, about that kind of language?
Well, he inserted the word vermin into his speech last weekend in New Hampshire. It was a traditional rift against what he calls the communists and the socialists and the fascists who were supposedly trying to take over the government and the forces he's fighting. But into that list, he threw in the word vermin, and that struck a lot of people badly because that is the term that fascists back in the 1920s and the 1930s used. Benito Mussolini started it, referring to his opponents as vermin that needed to be exterminated, and Hitler picked up the theme in the 1930s. So to many people, it represented quite the escalation in Trump's rhetoric.
And what other escalating rhetoric have we been hearing from the former president in recent weeks?
Well, like I say, he refers to his enemies as communists, and the enemy within is another one of the phrases that he uses. It's not just that he's looking at political opponents. He's looking at political opponents who are trying to ruin the United States or destroy the United States. Apocalyptic terms, and it's quite unusual for the U.S. political trail, and it's something that Trump's been doing it for a while. He's always been an aggressive speaker, especially since he got into politics back in 2016, but it seems to be getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a different level. Could Trump's legal troubles be fueling this ramped up rhetoric, or what's behind it at this point?
That's one of the theories. There's several reasons for it. One is being that Trump is simply trying to appeal to the far right elements of his constituency. And another theory out there is that he is very anxious about the criminal trials that he's facing. He could face the prospect of 4 criminal trials next year. He also has a bunch of civil actions against him. There's no doubt that he's feeling the pressure from these lawsuits and indictments, and it's manifested itself on the campaign trail. So, yeah, I think part of it is the anxiety he's facing over the prospect that he could be convicted of crimes and sentenced to prison during an election year.
David, how does the Trump team respond to these observations that Trump's speech is shifting?
Well, they really don't, except for the fact they call the critics snowflakes who don't understand the threats the country is facing. I mean, they cast Trump as the truth teller and that he's giving the unvarnished view of the kind of things that the Republicans are up against this year. So they don't excuse it or explain it. They just basically say that the people who are raising these issues are, like I say, snowflakes.
And what did Trump's Republican primary opponents say about his language at this point?
They're pretty low key, except for Chris Christie, who's often critical of the president. He's been saying that we should nominate anyone who's already on bail for criminal charges, and we certainly shouldn't nominate anyone who uses Nazi-like rhetoric. Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, who's rising in the polls, kind of criticized Trump for using vermin, said it was the kind of language she wouldn't use. So that's really the first we've heard from any of the opponents who are relatively close to Trump.
All right, USA Today national political correspondent David Jackson. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
A New York judge yesterday shot down Donald Trump's effort to get a mistrial in the civil fraud case that is seeking hundreds of millions of dollars and to block the former president from running a business in the state. Trump and several co-defendants argued in a court filing earlier this week that Judge Arthur Engoron harmed their right to a fair trial. They cited in part the prominent role that the judge's main law clerk plays in court. Engoron declared yesterday the complaints were without merit, saying, quote, "My principal law clerk does not make rulings or issue orders. I do," unquote. The ruling came a day after an appeals judge suspended a gag order on what Trump could say about court staffers, including Engoron's chief clerk. The lawsuit alleges that Trump and his company exaggerated his wealth on financial statements that were used to secure loans and make deals. Former First Lady Rosalynn Carter entered hospice care yesterday after the 96-year-old was previously diagnosed with dementia in May. The Carter Center said in a statement, quote, "She and President Carter are spending time with each other and their family. The Carter family continues to ask for privacy and remains grateful for the outpouring of love and support," unquote. Former President Jimmy Carter, who turned 99 last month, entered hospice care in February after a series of short hospital stays. His grandson, Jason Carter, told USA Today in September that his grandparents were nearing an end. He said, quote, "They are together, they are at home, they're in love, and I don't think anyone gets more than that," unquote. Colorado next month will launch a controversial experiment. State officials will reintroduce a number of gray wolves. I spoke with USA Today national correspondent Trevor Hughes about the project. Trevor, always good to have you on.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
So, Trevor, before we get to this relocation plan, I'm just curious, why has Colorado's wolf population been so decimated over the past few generations?
Well, when European settlers moved across the West, one of the things that they very deliberately did was kill wolves. People saw wolves as a threat to livestock, as a threat to humans, and frankly, as a threat to the game, elk and deer that they were hunting themselves to eat. And so over the couple of centuries, as Europeans moved into the West, they essentially exterminated the wolf population almost everywhere across the West. And at one point, we were down to no more than about 1,000 wolves in the whole country, most of them in Minnesota.
So Colorado is now set to launch this experiment to relocate wolves. What will this plan entail exactly?
Because there are no wolves here, and because people have decided to reintroduce them, it's been very controversial. But essentially what Colorado has had to do is find another state with a healthy wolf pack and essentially ask for permission to remove those wolves, trap them, put GPS collars on them, and then drive them or fly them into Colorado and let them loose with the hope that they become a self-sustaining pack or packs here.
You mentioned it's controversial. What do defenders of this plan say about why it's important, and what do critics say? I know a lot of farmers and ranchers have issues with this.
We think about wolves as an apex predator who challenge our dominion over the land and other animals. I mean, there's a reason so many fairy tales involve the big bad wolf. And folks who want to see wolves back in the landscape say that they belong here, that they belonged here and were here for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years before any humans lived in this area. And so they evolved into an ecosystem that is now arguably out of balance because those wolves have been absent and because the ecosystem has lost those large-scale predators like wolves, and only humans are there to keep elk populations in check, for instance. For farmers and ranchers, this is a real concern. Wolves eat things. That is not up for debate. And wolves will eat cows and sheep just as happily as they would eat elk, and arguably easier because the cows are kept neatly behind a fence. When you talk about wolves, farmers and ranchers have a real concern that the wolves will kill their livestock, which then hurts their livelihood, but also poses a threat to their own families, right? People become afraid to be moving around in the woods at night or at dusk because they're fearful, whether or not that's true or not, that those wolves represent a threat.
Trevor, what's the latest around wolf hunting laws, both in Colorado or elsewhere? And what does this wolf release project mean for that debate?
Part of the challenge in dealing with wolves is that they are protected by the Endangered Species Act. Then they weren't, then they were, then they weren't. It's been ping-ponging back a few times. There have been any number of court battles between states, the federal government, wildlife advocacy organizations. And so there has been this rush when wolves have lost protections to hunt those wolves. Many people want to hunt wolves as something that they can boast about or brag about or take home and show and say, I killed a wolf here in America. But the federal government, generally takes a dim view of that. And the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, has really been trying to make sure that wolves are protected because she sees them as a keystone species in our country. In Colorado, the idea is that these wolves will return to the land and will fit naturally into a landscape that they always belonged in. The folks who want them back sort of make the point that humans are the ones who moved into the wolves' territory and not the other way around.
Trevor Hughes, great info as always. Thanks for the time.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
And be sure to tune in to The Excerpt tomorrow when my colleague Dana Taylor speaks with USA Today national columnist Suzette Hackney about gun violence, and one activist in particular, the late Coach Jose Quezada. You can find the episode right here on this feed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. If you have any comments, you can always find us at podcasts@usatoday.com. You'll hear Dana tomorrow, and I'll be back Monday with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.